The year was 1942. Over the vast cloud-veiled skies of Europe, the Luftwaffe still ruled. German fighter aces, veterans of the Battle of Britain, moved with confidence born of thousands of sorties. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and FW190s seemed untouchable. Across the Channel, Allied pilots flew shorter-ranged aircraft that could only escort bombers part way. Beyond that invisible line, bombers were on their own. American aircrews called it flying through hell without angels. Each mission over Germany cost dozens of lives. Formation after formation disappeared into flak and fire. The P-47 Thunderbolt, tough but thirsty, simply couldn't stay long enough to protect the bombers to Berlin and back. And so, the Luftwaffe smiled. At airfields from Le Bourget to Schweinfurt, German pilots spoke of Allied technology with disdain. American planes, one ace joked, are like tourists. They visit, then go home. Even their intelligence reports noted that no single-engine Allied fighter had the range to threaten the German capital. Berlin, they said, would remain safe. But in a hangar in Britain, something new was being readied, an aircraft slender in frame yet fierce in purpose, the North American P-51 Mustang. Born from a British request, refined by American engineering, it would soon change everything the Luftwaffe believed about the sky. At first, few took notice. The earliest Mustangs used Allison engines and performed poorly at high altitude. They were sent to reconnaissance and low-level missions while the big boys fought at 25,000 feet. German aces barely logged them in their combat reports. But then came a new roar over England. A deep, confident sound from a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin transformed the Mustang into a predator. Suddenly the aircraft could climb and fight at altitude with the best of them, and fly far beyond. With external drop tanks, it could escort bombers to Berlin and return without refueling. For the first time in the war, Allied commanders saw a path to air superiority over the Reich itself. In briefing rooms at Bottisham and Debden, pilots of the 8th Air Force looked at maps covered with red pins marking lost crews. They listened as their commanders spoke of the new escort fighter. The word Berlin appeared on mission charts for the first time. There was skepticism, of course. Too many men had seen too many promises of new machines. But when the first Mustangs lifted off from cold English runways, their shadows seemed to stretch eastward, toward Germany itself. The Germans still laughed. One Luftwaffe commander reportedly remarked, "Let the Americans come to Berlin. We'll welcome them with flak and fire." Yet even as those words were spoken, a new generation of American pilots was taking to the air, calm, focused, and ready to test the truth. The first encounters came over Western Germany in late 1943. Luftwaffe interceptors climbed to attack the B-17s and B-24s as they always had. But this time, silver-winged figures dived out of the sun. Mustangs, fast, sleek, and unexpectedly fearless. They didn't turn for home when the bombers crossed the Rhine. They kept coming. The German radar operators were confused. Their reports stated, "New enemy fighter does not break off." Within weeks, Luftwaffe intelligence officers realized what they were facing. The Mustang's range was nearly double that of the Thunderbolt or Spitfire. Its high-altitude performance was superb, and its pilots were learning fast. One of them was Major James Howard, a former Flying Tiger. In January 1944, he single-handedly defended a formation of B-17s near Oschersleben for half an hour, fighting off more than 30 German fighters. When the bombers landed, the crew simply radioed one line: "There's a fighter up here who's doing a hell of a job." Howard received the Medal of Honor. To the Germans, the message was clear. This new aircraft was not a tourist. By spring 1944, Mustangs flew in mass formation escorts. Their distinct silhouettes became symbols of hope to bomber crews. They crossed the Rhine, passed Hanover, and headed straight for Berlin. And in March 1944, the impossible happened. For the first time, American single-engine fighters roared over the German capital. Berliners looked up in shock as the sunlight caught the silver wings. Even Goebbels noted in his diary that the sight of enemy fighters over Berlin was a psychological blow greater than any bomb. The Luftwaffe had been mocking the Mustang for months. Now the mockery echoed beneath those very wings. At Allied airfields, pilots stood around maps marking the Berlin missions in red ink. Aces like Don Blakesley and John Meyer spoke quietly about the difference the P-51 had made. They were not boastful. They were focused. Every escort meant fewer empty beds at the mess that night. Each Mustang that returned brought back dozens of bomber crews who otherwise would not have survived. By the end of that month, the balance of power in the air was shifting. The Germans still had formidable pilots and aircraft, but their confidence was eroding. The sky above Germany was no longer the same. The winter of 1943 turned Europe grey. From above, the skies looked endless, but to the men flying through them, they were shrinking fast. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous. Its pilots were masters of the air, hardened by years of combat. Names like Hartmann, Barkhorn and Rell carried the weight of hundreds of victories. They believed no machine could rival their experience. No Allied pilot could match their instincts. At briefing tables across occupied Europe, squadrons of Bf-109s and FW-190s prepared for battle. They studied maps, wind charts and radio intercepts. They knew where the bombers would come, and they knew the Americans would follow. The plan was simple: break the escort, then tear the bombers apart. But this time, the hunters would find the tables turned. The morning missions over Brunswick and Leipzig began as they always did, with the low rumble of engines rolling across frozen airfields. As the bomber streams formed over the North Sea, hundreds of aircraft glinted under the pale sun. Inside their cockpits, the gunners tightened their gloves and scanned the horizon. They expected the Luftwaffe to come, and it did, fast and hard. German interceptors dove from 25,000 feet, guns blazing, cutting through the formation like hawks. Dozens of bombers fell in the first 10 minutes. Then something unexpected appeared at their 6 o'clock. Mustangs, diving from the clouds. They had followed the bombers all the way from England. No one thought they could, but they did. The first dogfights were brutal. The P-51s were new, their pilots still learning to trust their machines. The Luftwaffe was experienced, its men confident and aggressive. They expected the Americans to fight briefly, then turn for home. Instead, the Mustangs stayed. They climbed, rolled, and turned with precision that startled even the German veterans. For the first time, Allied fighters could chase the enemy deep into his own airspace. A new kind of battle began, one the Luftwaffe was not prepared for. Over Hanover, a German flight leader radioed, "New enemy type, very long range, cannot shake them." His voice carried both surprise and fatigue. By the end of the day, 12 of his group's fighters were gone. The survivors returned to bases running low on fuel and even lower on hope. It wasn't just the machine that changed the war, it was the system behind it. The Allies could replace aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could refuel. American factories worked day and night, turning out Mustangs by the hundreds. Pilots were trained in waves. Every time a squadron took losses, replacements arrived within weeks. Germany could not match that rhythm. But the air war remained deadly. Every mission came at a price. The 8th Air Force lost men by the dozens, even with Mustang escorts. The P-51s could defend, but they couldn't stop flak. Shells exploded in perfect black spheres across the sky. Engines burst, wings sheared away, and smoke trailed like ribbons through the clouds. Inside each bomber, the sound was deafening. The metallic rain of shrapnel, the cries over the intercom, the cold, oxygen-thin air filling the lungs. Yet through it all, they saw the silver fighters weaving in and out of formation, fighting off enemy aircraft again and again. Back in Germany, Luftwaffe command began to panic. Every week, reports arrived from Jagdgeschwader units. Losses heavy. Enemy fighter escort increasing range. Hitler demanded answers. Hermann Göring, once so confident, was furious that American fighters could now reach Berlin. He dismissed early reports as exaggeration until he saw it himself. When P-51s appeared above Berlin in March 1944, Göring reportedly said, "When I saw Mustangs over the capital, I knew the war was lost. It was a moment of bitter realization. The Reich's air defense could no longer guarantee its own sky." Still, the Luftwaffe fought on. German engineers introduced the FW-190D Dora and Bf-109G-10, faster, higher-flying versions built to counter the Mustang. They were powerful machines, but they came too late, and there were too few pilots left to fly them well. The training schools had become shadows of their former selves. Fuel shortages forced practice flights to be reduced or cancelled entirely. Many young pilots met the enemy for the first time in real combat. Most never returned. Meanwhile, the Americans were improving their tactics. They created fighter sweeps, Mustang groups flying ahead of the bombers to clear the skies before the main formation arrived. This meant the Luftwaffe was attacked even before it could climb to intercept altitude. Every engagement drained its strength further. One German ace, Günther Rall, later admitted, "The P-51 was the perfect airplane. If we turned, it turned. If we climbed, it climbed higher. If we dived, it stayed on our tail. It was a nightmare." His words echoed what many already knew. The air war over Europe was no longer equal. The once proud Luftwaffe had become the hunted. By summer, Allied pilots were escorting bombers deep into Czechoslovakia and Austria. They strafed airfields, rail yards, and fuel depots, cutting off the arteries of the German war machine. Every sortie eroded the Luftwaffe's ability to fight back. At the end of each mission, the bomber crews would gather in silence, counting the empty spaces in the mess hall. The Mustang pilots often joined them. They had done their best, but the war in the air spared no one. Each loss reminded them that the sky was both ally and enemy, a vast arena that demanded everything. Still, the mood had changed. What once felt like desperation was slowly replaced by quiet confidence. The Allies were pushing deeper, the Germans fighting harder, and somewhere in that deadly balance, the outcome of the air war was being decided. The spring of 1944 arrived with grey skies and restless hearts. Across the airfields of England, the sound of engines replaced the sound of silence. Each dawn brought another mission, another long line of silver aircraft stretching toward the horizon. The men no longer counted the number of sorties. They counted the names of those who didn't return. In the cold light of morning, the P-51 squadrons gathered for briefing. Maps covered the walls. Thick red lines traced over Belgium, the Ruhr, and deep into Saxony. "Target Regensburg, then back across enemy territory," the briefing officer said, his voice calm, practiced, tired. Few words were wasted. Everyone knew what that meant. It meant fuel calculations balanced against survival. It meant facing the flak belts and fighter screens again. Major Don Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, was known for his quiet discipline. He didn't give speeches, he gave results. When a young pilot once asked him for advice before his first Berlin mission, Blakesley simply replied, "Don't turn back. Ever." It wasn't bravado. It was endurance distilled into words. At 10,000 feet, the frost on the canopy turned to mist. The Mustangs leveled out, sunlight flashing off their wings like a silver river in the sky. Below them, the bomber formations looked endless. Hundreds of B-17s moving eastward, their contrails forming long white scars against the blue. Somewhere ahead, flak bursts waited like black blossoms. As the first explosions appeared near Leipzig, the Mustangs went to work. Pairs of fighters peeled off from formation, diving toward enemy interceptors climbing through the haze. Over the radio came the calm voices of men whose fear had long since burned away. "Bandits! 11 o'clock high. Brake left. Foxed him. He's smoking." It was controlled chaos, an entire generation of men fighting miles above the earth with the precision of instinct. For the German pilots below, the sky was now an ambush. No longer could they climb freely to the bombers. The P-51s were always there, waiting. Courage came in quiet forms. A wingman who stayed close through a dive. A pilot who circled a damaged bomber all the way home. refusing to leave its side, a ground crewman who worked through the night in freezing rain to ready a plane for dawn takeoff. These men rarely appeared in the headlines, but their endurance made victory possible. Inside the cockpits, the world shrank to a handful of dials, a heartbeat, and the hum of the Merlin engine. That sound, low, steady, alive, was more than mechanical. It was the rhythm of survival. When the mission seemed endless, when the horizon showed only clouds and fire, that hum reminded them they were still in control. The Luftwaffe still fought with ferocity. New German pilots, barely 20 years old, rose to meet the Allied formations, many without even the experience of a full training program. Their bravery was unquestionable, but courage could not replace time, and time was something Germany no longer had. Mustang pilots began to notice a change. The enemy aircraft were fewer, the attacks less coordinated. Sometimes the skies felt empty. It was a strange and unsettling silence, as if the air war itself was holding its breath. When the Mustangs reached Berlin again in May 1944, there was no longer laughter on the ground. Searchlights swept the sky in frantic arcs, flak batteries thundered from the outskirts, but few German fighters came up to meet them. The war that once felt distant was now on Germany's doorstep. Among the bomber crews, word spread quickly. The escorts stayed with us all the way again. Morale began to rise. They had angels in the sky now, real ones made of steel and determination. Back in England, the return landings were quiet moments of exhaustion. Each pilot climbed down from his cockpit, face streaked with sweat and oil, hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline faded. They didn't cheer. They just looked at each other and nodded. They had made it home again. Today, the maintenance crews swarmed the planes before the engines cooled. Bullet holes were patched, fuel lines inspected, spent shells cleared from the wings. Each aircraft was a survivor in its own right, a piece of metal that had faced the fury of the Reich and come back. In the mess halls, the stories spread like smoke. Some men spoke softly about the fights over Hanover, others about the bomber that exploded beside them at 25,000 feet. No one mentioned fear directly, but it was there, shared, understood, never named. As summer approached, the Allied strategy intensified. Every successful escort brought them closer to dominance. Every raid further weakened the enemy's infrastructure. The Mustangs weren't just fighters now. They were escorts, guardians, and hunters all in one. They chased trains, trucks, and airfields. They struck the Luftwaffe even before takeoff. By June, the German fighter force was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Yet the men kept flying east. Day after day, mission after mission, they carried the same burden. Survive, protect, and endure. Even the bravest grew weary. Endurance, they learned, wasn't about strength. It was about returning to the sky, knowing you might not come back, and going anyway. By the eve of D-Day, the air war had transformed completely. The P-51s owned the daylight. They patrolled the skies over France, waiting for the signal that would unleash the invasion. The courage of thousands of pilots, American, British, Polish, Canadian, had forged a shield that would make the landings possible. The mockery from the Luftwaffe had gone silent. In its place came quiet respect, even admiration. German pilots knew what they were up against now, and many faced it with grim acknowledgement. The Mustang had earned its place in the war's story, not through boasting, but through relentless endurance. By mid-1944, the balance had shifted, though few dared to say it aloud. The airfields of France and the Low Countries were craters of silence. Everywhere the smell of burned aviation fuel lingered. Where once the black crosses had swarmed above the bombers, now came only scattered formations. Young faces in borrowed flight suits, flying machines that had lost their war before takeoff. The Allies no longer flew to survive. They flew to finish what they had started. Retaliation began quietly, not in vengeance, but in calculation. The 8th Air Force changed its orders. Don't wait for them to come up. Go find them. Squadrons of Mustangs rose from English bases before dawn. crossed the Channel in silence, and swept deep into occupied territory. Searching, striking, vanishing again. They attacked airfields at Cambrai, Stendal, Paderborn. They strafed runways, fuel trucks, and hangars until nothing moved. Each mission crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to rise for the next one. By destroying the enemy before he left the ground, the Allies rewrote the rules of air combat. The hunters had become the hunted, and the hunted were running out of sky. Some German veterans still fought with terrifying skill. Erich Hartmann, the Blonde Knight, scored victory after victory, even as the world collapsed around him. But even he admitted later that for every Mustang he downed, 10 more seemed to appear. Germany's pilots no longer fought for victory. They fought for survival, for the hope of landing with one engine still breathing. Fuel shortages grew desperate. Entire training programs were grounded. Experienced aces were ordered to fly until their machines or their bodies gave out. One Luftwaffe mechanic wrote in his diary, "We send them up knowing they will not return, and still we cheer them on." The war in the air had become a slow-motion collapse, witnessed by the very men inside it. Meanwhile, Allied confidence was turning into momentum. By June, the P-51s escorted bombers over the beaches of Normandy. From the first light of D-Day, they owned the sky. German reinforcements that tried to move by daylight were shredded before reaching the front. Every bridge, every rail line, every convoy that dared to move beneath open air was marked by Mustang shadows. The voice of the Merlin engine had become the anthem of Allied advance. In just 6 months, the Luftwaffe had lost over half its operational fighters. Pilots who once mocked the Mustang now spoke its name with a kind of weary respect. Even German civilians recognized it. Its long nose and silver wings etched into memory as the sign that the tide had turned. From the English coast to the heart of Bavaria, momentum rolled like thunder. American and British commanders pressed their advantage with precision. Air superiority wasn't just a term. It was the living, breathing condition that made invasion possible. Every day, the air war fed the ground war. Convoys moved unchallenged. Factories in Germany burned for weeks. When the smoke cleared, the once invincible Luftwaffe was a ghost of itself. But for the men in the cockpits, the price remained the same. Every victory meant another empty seat in the mess that night. Retaliation had purpose, but never joy. In late July, as Allied armies broke out from Normandy, the Mustangs pushed even deeper. They flew ramrod missions, sweeps designed to lure out the last defenders. At high altitude, they waited above the clouds. When the German formations appeared, the battles unfolded in seconds. Tracer lines cut through the morning haze, and the sky filled with fragments of aluminum and smoke. Down below, civilians stared upward at the thunder they could no longer influence. Children hid in fields as falling aircraft burned across the horizon. It was no longer a duel of equals. It was history catching up. The Luftwaffe still claimed occasional victories. Now and then a Mustang went down, spiraling through the clouds, its pilot bailing out over enemy territory. Many became prisoners, some never found. But even these losses could not slow the advance. Each week, new P-51s arrived from assembly lines in Inglewood and Dallas. Each week, more trained pilots filled the rosters. War had become industrial mathematics, and Germany was outnumbered on every axis. Momentum became rhythm. Fighter groups began competing not for kills, but for mission efficiency. Escort completion rates, return ratios, fuel economy. The war had become professionalized to the point of inevitability. And yet inside that machinery were still hearts that felt every name written on every wall of remembrance. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a Mustang ace, later said, "We weren't heroes. We were just doing our job, and our job never seemed to end." That quiet truth carried more weight than any medal. By September 1944, Allied control of the air was absolute. The bombers flew with confidence across the Reich. Mustangs escorted them as far as Warsaw and back. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been broken not by a single battle, but by the relentless tide of retaliation and endurance. Berlin's sky no longer belonged to the Reich. It belonged to the men who once could only dream of reaching it. By the first weeks of 1945, the war in the air was no longer a contest of skill. It was a measure of endurance. Snow blanketed Europe. Fuel was scarce. Engines groaned in the cold. But from England to France to Belgium, Allied airfields hummed like a machine with no off switch. The Mustangs had become ubiquitous. A metal sky woven from persistence. Every day they rose in formation, escorting the bombers that now struck Germany at will. Each mission erased another factory, another railway, another hope that the Reich could recover. Inside the Luftwaffe's command bunkers, maps once covered with colour pins were fading into grey. Entire fighter groups existed only on paper. Communications officers stopped asking for status reports. There was no one left to answer. Operation Bodenplatte was Germany's final gamble. On January 1, 1945, at dawn, the Luftwaffe launched its last massive strike against Allied airfields in Western Europe. The aim was simple: destroy as many fighters on the ground as possible and buy one more month of life for the Reich. It was a spectacle of desperation. Hundreds of FW-190s and Bf-109s took off in fog and snow, many piloted by boys barely trained for formation flying. Some got lost in the clouds, others were shot down by their own flak crews, who mistook them for Allied aircraft. When the smoke cleared, the Luftwaffe had inflicted damage. Dozens of Allied planes destroyed on the ground. But the cost was catastrophic. Nearly 300 German fighters were lost in a single day, along with some of the last veteran aces still alive. The attack that was meant to revive Germany's air power instead killed it. For the Mustang pilots waiting on frozen runways that morning, the rumours spread quickly. Bodenplatte, they called it, the day the Eagles fell. From that point on, the sky belonged entirely to them. Allied commanders responded without hesitation. They launched continuous fighter sweeps across the Rhine, destroying what remained of Germany's airfields. The P-51s no longer escorted bombers. They hunted for targets of their own. Trains, trucks, and convoys became moving marks for their guns. Each day, the Merlin engines sang the song of inevitability. By February, the skies over the Reich were almost empty. Occasionally, a Me-262 jet would appear, a glimpse of future technology too late to matter. The Mustang pilots learned to attack them during takeoff and landing, when the jets were slow and vulnerable. Even Germany's most advanced aircraft could not alter the outcome. In the north, P-51s escorted bombers striking U-boat pens and shipyards. In the south, they patrolled the Alps to block retreating troops. From east to west, the sky was a single pulse of silver wings and trails of vapor. Amid this momentum, a different battle was fought, a moral one. The pilots began to question the cost. Each victory felt hollow, each mission a reminder that war's glory had long since died. When Mustang squadrons strafed trains carrying refugees by mistake, the reports were kept quiet, but the men remembered. The war had become total, and that total weighed on every soul in the cockpit. One pilot wrote home, "We no longer chase victories, we chase endings." As March approached, Berlin was a city under siege from the air. Factories stood silent. Smoke curtains hung permanently over the streets. Children played in craters that used to be parks. The once fearsome air defense network was reduced to scattered batteries firing blindly into the clouds. For the Allied pilots, there was no joy in the sight. They had trained to fight men, not cities. Now they flew through the ghost of what had been Germany's pride. Their mission no longer to conquer, but to end. When the Red Army approached Berlin in April 1945, the Mustangs flew their final escort missions over the Elbe. They met almost no resistance. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The men in the air watched columns of German soldiers marching west to surrender. Below them, the roads were clogged with refugees and wreckage. Above them, nothing but silence. After years of combat, the sky was finally still. When victory was announced, The celebrations were quiet. There were no parades in the airfields, no triumphal cheers. The pilots stood beside their machines in the soft light of dawn, listening to the engines cool. They had outlived what once seemed unconquerable. Now they felt only relief and the strange emptiness that follows survival. The P-51 Mustang had begun its life mocked as a tourist's toy. It ended the war as the guardian of a generation. Its pilots did not claim to have won the war alone, but without them, victory might have come too late, or not at all. In the ruins of Berlin, a German child watched the sky that spring and asked his father, "Will they ever come back?" The father replied, "Not for war, maybe someday for peace." Above them, high in the clear air, a lone Mustang banked and turned for home, its engine echoing like a heartbeat over a broken continent. The guns fell silent in May 1945, but the echoes remained. Across Europe, the sky that once burned with contrails now hung clear and painfully blue. The pilots who had filled it with thunder found themselves grounded, alive, yet unsure what to do with peace. In England, the airfields emptied one by one. Runways once crowded with Mustangs grew over with grass and silence. The smell of oil lingered, a ghost of the war that had defined their youth. Men who had lived each day by the rhythm of takeoff and landing suddenly faced stillness. Some packed their uniforms away forever. Others kept their flight jackets hanging near the door, as if they might be called again tomorrow. When the survivors gathered, they did not speak of numbers or medals. They spoke of moments. A wingman who didn't make it home. The first sight of Berlin under sunlight. The sound of the Merlin engine echoing off the clouds. They laughed softly at their own fear, and then fell quiet when they remembered how close it had come to ending differently. The war in the air had taken more than lives. It had taken innocence. But it had also given something fragile and rare, respect between enemies. Years later, in a hangar in Germany, a former Luftwaffe pilot met a Mustang ace. They shook hands in silence. No flags, no speeches. Just two men who had once tried to kill each other, now bound by the same memory of wind, fear, and survival. One of them said, "We were all just boys following orders from men who would never fly." The other nodded. The war between them had ended long ago. What remained was understanding. For the Mustang itself, the story did not end in 1945. It flew again, in Korea, in reconnaissance, in air shows, in hearts. Even as jets replaced propellers, the image of the P-51 remained a symbol of grace through strength. It was a machine that carried the idea of endurance beyond its own generation. In museums today, the planes stand polished and still. Visitors look up at them with awe, unaware that beneath the paint lie patches, bullet holes, and the fingerprints of the men who once trusted them with their lives. Every rivet tells a story. Every dent is a line of human history written in aluminum. Time has softened the noise of the war, but not its meaning. For those who lived it, the lessons were clear. Technology wins battles, but character wins wars. The Mustang proved that courage and design could merge into something more. A bridge between survival and hope. In the decades that followed, historians called it the fighter that saved the bombers. Pilots called it simply the one that brought us home. Across the Atlantic, veterans' reunions became smaller each year. The faces aged, the stories grew shorter, and the engines that once roared now idled only for ceremony. When the propellers turned at air shows, children covered their ears at the thunder, not knowing that for the men watching, that sound was sacred. It was the sound of life borrowed from the edge. In one of those gatherings, a pilot's daughter asked her father, "Were you brave, Dad?" He thought for a long moment and said, "No, we were just scared together." That's what bravery really was. The room fell silent. No one argued. Meanwhile, in Germany, restorers rebuilt a single FW-190 beside an American P-51 for a museum display. They were painted as they once were. Enemy colors side by side. Visitors stood between them, seeing not opposition, but symmetry. Two wings, two engines, two generations of men who believed their cause was right, and who paid the same price in the same sky. war in the end had belonged to no one. By the turn of the century, the surviving Mustangs were few, but each flight drew crowds that fell silent when the propellers spun. The engine's growl rose from history itself, a reminder of what men once dared in thin air and uncertain light. When the aircraft lifted off, even the birds seemed to pause. The sky, after all, remembers. In archives and documentaries, the statistics remain. Miles flown, sorties logged, victories claimed. But numbers cannot hold emotion. Only stories can. Stories of laughter in mess halls before dawn, of trembling hands gripping control sticks, of friendships born in clouds and lost in smoke. The Mustang carried those stories across the years like a living chronicle of courage. As the film of history fades to its closing frame, one truth remains as steady as the hum of a Merlin engine. Every war ends, but the courage to rise again, to believe in flight after falling, is what endures. The German aces once mocked the Mustang. They saw it as fragile, foreign, fleeting. But when the smoke cleared and the world began to rebuild, it was the Mustang that lingered, not as a weapon, but as a promise that humanity could learn, could change, and could someday fly without hate,